And while I think some might say, humanism is this, period, right? I think that aligning with you, I think it is an evolving process. And specifically, as we look into the understandings of we um, how we evolve, how we change, how we're challenged, right, by our human experience and our human condition.
The views and opinions expressed on this episode of Growing Up Fundie are not the views and opinions of the company that the guest works for or any organization that they are affiliated with. They are simply the opinions of the guest. Anthony Cruz Pantojas, thank you so much for joining me on this episode of Growing Up Fundie. How are you doing this afternoon?
I am doing well, so delighted to be here.
Yeah, I'm excited to have you. So I originally read about you on the Secular Student Alliance list of presenters and speakers. And then when I was reading into your background was just you've got like a little bit of everything. I just knew I really wanted to get you on an episode and talk to you. I found out everything from languages you speak to awards you've won. And I think one of them even said you put honey in your coffee. And that's one of my favorite things to do too. So I was like, done. Kindred spirits. Got to talk to this guy.
Amazing.
But enough from me. Tell us a little bit about yourself in your own words.
Sure. So as you just said beautifully, my name is Anthony Cruz Pantojas. I use they, he, ella, él, serious pronouns. And I currently serve since 2021 as the Humanist Chaplain at Tufts University.
And for somebody who maybe isn't familiar with what that means, what does that mean for you?
Yeah, I mean, basically what it means that I've been hired by the university to really accompany and support students through processes of meaning making, explorations around spirituality, religion, ethics, civic engagement, and everything else in between.
Yeah. It's not often I feel like that we see the title humanist and chaplain kind of side by side, and I thought that was really intriguing. So in terms of you personally, do you identify as a religious person or a specific religion, or what is it that you identify as?
Yeah, so I mean, we would need to go back in history, of course.
Yeah.
I was born and raised between the Apostolic Prophetic Movement, which is a sect within Christianity, and the Roman Catholic tradition in Puerto Rico, where I was born and raised and did all of my college years. During that time, though, I began to explore my sexuality, my queerness as I was a Christian. And that was a quick way out, of course, after more than a decade of being a Christian. Then I started my college years and I majored in social sciences, specializing specifically in anthropology.
Wow.
And even though I was doing that work, I still really desired to be in community. That was so crucial in my upbringing and in my own cultural experience that I was wanting it, desiring that. And so I ended up actually visiting Temple Beth Shalom in San Juan, in Condado specifically, which is a Reformed Jewish congregation. And I was enamored by that community and ended up being there, healing in that space, ended up becoming a Jew by choice. And it was actually through that community that I ended up finding humanism.
Wow.
That's the very short.
Yeah, that's cool. I was going to say, I know that's short because I looked you up. I know there's like a lot more than that. But if you had to describe what humanism means to you, to somebody who maybe is just finding out about it, what would you say humanism is?
The beautiful question. I think that humanism, as far as I've defined it for myself and have experienced it, I think it's a continued practice. Mm-hmm. Right, I think that humanism is really connecting the theories of everyday life with meaningful practice, where we're really looking at, in my understanding, how do we be together as a human species, as human and animal species, right? As we're connecting to the natural world, as we're connecting to most of the complexities of being human, right?
Yes.
Both its challenges, its possibilities. And specifically, I think that we move between this dimension of culture, power, and spirituality.
Yeah,
And of course,
absolutely.
ethics.
Yes, yes. Yeah, I try to tell people, I'm like, humanism is like the art of studying human beings, like the art of studying who we are, why
Yes,
we
yes,
are,
yes.
what we are, and just making sure that we respect everybody while we're doing it. Like that's pretty much what it is. Because
Oh my gosh.
I feel like a lot of times humanism is associated with atheism. And while that is common, that's not the case. Like you can be a Christian humanist or a Jewish humanist or a Buddhist humanist or an atheist humanist, as long as you are somebody who is interested in people and how we exist and how we can improve our existence and how we can kind of figure out how to be kind to each other and take care of each other a little bit better. You're a humanist, right? In my opinion.
I am so stoked by that because actually in our national conference at the Association of Chaplaincy and Spiritual Life in Higher Ed, where I also serve as a board member, I presented on humanism, art of living,
Mm,
possibilities in a changing world, because you're so on point. I think that it is both an art and it's a practice, right? That's
yeah.
embodied. And I think that when we use that framework of art, right, not reducing it just to like art as in museums or art history, but actually that it is something that's in the liminal dimension, right, in the
Yeah.
interstices, that it's not fully definable. And
Yeah.
yet, yes, I think that humanism by default is a secular perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And I think a lot of these isms like feminism, humanism, I think they are something that you're never done. Like you never finish humanism. You never reach like the last level of humanism. You're always figuring out and learning and growing and observing because people are always changing and society is always changing. So are the isms, right? They're always changing. And so when somebody's a humanist, I feel like they are actively a humanist and they will always be a humanist as opposed to having been a humanist and finished it, like a degree a while ago or something like that.
Yes, I mean, I always say that when I talk about humanism, right, is that my humanism is intersectional, is embodied, and is decolonial. And
Yeah.
for me, it's so important to mention those three dimensions
Yes.
because, as you mentioned, it is this this eliciting, right, of the human experience
Yeah.
that is always evolving, is always changing. And while I think some might say, humanism is this period, right, I think that aligning with you, I think it is an evolving process. And specifically, as we look into the understandings of we um, how we evolve, how we change, how we're challenged, right, by our human experience and our human condition.
Yeah, yeah. And I also think it's really important in terms of changing as people, because as much as we watch other people change, I think you need to pay attention to how much you change, right? And I feel like some people embrace change, some people ward off change, right? I think we see it especially in like the things we used to post on social media. We look at that person and we're like, who is that? Who was that person who thought that was funny or thought that was a good picture or like thought that this was important? Part of being a humanist is accepting the change as much as you observe the change and like embracing the change and figuring out what that means for you and how by allowing yourself to change you are also comfortable with everybody else around you changing, in
And
my
I think
opinion.
that's like the broader invitation, I think, for people that are exploring, let's say, as an umbrella term, right, non-theist
Mhm.
communities and organizations, is that we're always unfolding, we're always
Yes,
evolving,
yes.
we're always growing, hopefully. And at the same time, our organizations are a reflection, right, of both the aspirational as well as the limitations that we ourselves embody in a specific time, place, and location.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And so, since you've kind of embraced humanism and been introduced to it, would you say that you've changed a lot as a person? Like, are there things that stick out to you where you're like, wow, this is night and day?
Yeah, I mean, definitely. I think that slowly, as you're saying, I'm still evolving, I'm still
Yep,
unfolding,
yep.
but I've become more, I've embraced my queerness,
Yeah.
I've embraced talking about kings, and even though I'm not a polyamorous in embodiment, right? Philosophically, I've embraced polyamory, um, and really just embracing life. Like seriously,
Yeah.
like life is messy, it's complex,
Yes.
it's violent.
Yes.
There's not one road, I would
Yes.
say, right? But I think that that has definitely made life more interesting, right? Of that
Absolutely.
invitation of like, now I'm not just funneled into one specific framework or theology or way of life. I'm really challenged to really explore my own prejudices, biases, areas of growth, right? And how am I hopefully being in relationship with others to then be challenged and invited
Yes.
to explore how is that in relationship to my own life stance and understanding.
Yes, absolutely. I'm so glad you said that about prejudices and biases. When we're young, we have these opinions and they are our true opinions, at the time. And they are, we're ride or die. This is the air we breathe. We will never have a different opinion than this, so we're wearing it on shirts and we're putting it on the internet. We're saying it to anybody who will listen to it. And then as you meet new kinds of people and as you open kind of your mind to new kinds of people, um, especially patient people who have the time to kind of like question and explain things to you as opposed to just like argue with you on the internet about it, you find so many things have changed about what you think over the years. And sometimes you notice it. Sometimes you're like, wow, light switch, I'm changing tomorrow. And other times it's like a very gradual process.
Right.
I remember, I think it's funny that you said kinks, because one of the times I remember really being kind of like slapped in the face with my opinions might need a little bit of work there is I remember when I was in college, I was talking to a woman who was in the master's program there at my school. She was on
Mm.
debate with me. And we were talking about, like, I think we were reading some true crime story in the news about some serial killer. And I made the comment where I was like, oh, I bet this guy has like women tied up in his basement, like some BDSM thing. And she said, because I didn't know she was big in the BDSM community. And she's like, actually, if he has women tied up in his basement non-consensually, he's probably not involved in
Mm.
BDSM. And I was like, what do you mean? And she's like, well, if they are there because they want to be there and that's what they want to do, that could be BDSM. But if they're down there and he didn't ask their permission and he didn't get their consent, that's actually really frowned upon in the BDSM
Right.
community.
Right.
And I remember I was just like, oh, because in my mind, I was thinking it was just a joke. But at the same time, it was such a learning opportunity because we
Right.
just throw comments like that out all the time, and they can be harmful, or they can be incorrect, or they can cause biases and stereotypes that I didn't even know I had. I didn't even have any issue with the BDSM community, but here I was calling them serial killers who like have people tied up in their basements. The original thing that interested me in interviewing you and talking to you was this faith in the vaccine organization group, or would I say organization, club, company?
Sure. Thank you so much for that question. Yes, so Faith in the Vaccine, basically, it was a project that emerged, of course, at the height of the pandemic. And basically, it was a response, right, to the understanding of, first of all, the Miller Center for Interreligious Learning, right, which is located at Hebrew College, which is a rabbinical and Jewish institution, in collaboration with Interfaith Youth Corps, now Interfaith America, and other organizations like Turn In, Reach Out, We Got Us, and other partnership organizations came together in the Boston area and said, hey, like this global pandemic clearly is not just in the realm of biology. It's not just in the realm of genetics. It's not just epidemiological. There is also this socio cultural and religious dimension that's impacting, right, marginalized communities. And so basically they all came together and created the Faith in the Vaccine Student Ambassador Program. And again, it was really looking at youth, actually, training them by bringing, you know, medical doctors, clergy, professionals, clinicians, you name it, right? During the summer, and basically providing them the tools, the knowledge, the resources, the mentorship and leadership to be able to go back and speak to their communities around specifically COVID vaccine hesitancy.
Wow. And so I was reading about that, and the description specifically mentioned marginalized communities. And I was curious, what do you think the emphasis on marginalized communities came from the most? Was it that they don't have the same access to, say, medical professionals? Is it like a language barrier where perhaps the news they're hearing about the vaccine is different? Is it a little bit of everything? What is it that you think impacts them the most when it comes to that?
It's all of it. It's all of it. That's why care should be holistic,
Yes.
right? It's really understanding the architecture. I mean, if we're contextualizing it, right, of how Boston or Massachusetts, better stated, right, was created, how it developed, and how it continues to develop, right, serving and supporting predominantly the affluent white communities. And we see this if you look at the public transportation and you see where are the places with more stops, with more access, with hospitals, with better supermarkets, right? And
Yes.
all of these things is in affluent white communities.
Mhm.
And where for example, do you see the highest number of COVID cases, right? You see it in places that have less access to public transportation, to the medical facilities,
Right.
to care in general. And so I
Right.
think that it was more of this critical framework analysis of saying, you know, what's happening as a society, as a state, and where do we need to support.
And was there anything that you saw while you were involved, and unless you're still involved, while you were involved in supporting this group that really like surprised you, or did you pretty much know what you were getting into when you joined?
Yeah, I mean, I kind of definitely knew what I was getting into, in part because I actually, during the height of the pandemic, did my first clinical psychospiritual education unit, which
Wow.
is to become a board certified chaplain, specifically in the medical setting. And I did it
Interesting.
at UC Davis Medical Center, where it was actually the first case of COVID was registered. I did it in summer of 2020, so literally a few months after the pandemic started. And so I had the experience and the lived reality of like running to patients' rooms, well, not running, but running to the hospital,
Yeah.
right? And taking care of patients and seeing that the majority of people that were, you know, being infected by COVID were marginalized communities. Then that connects then to, right, like religious and religious, spiritual, ethical worldviews, right? And
Yes.
how that could, of course, augment the fact that you might not be getting vaccinated, right? Which
Yes.
is a very huge component, especially in
Yes.
people from the global majority. I do not want to dismiss that,
Yeah.
right? But I think, first of all, we need to talk about access
Yes.
and information, especially, as you said, in the appropriate languages.
Yes, absolutely. And I can 100% see how, if we don't have somebody who's emphasizing needing to literally just translate what's going on in a
Right.
proper manner, it can be very scary and confusing. And it can be very easy to get misinformation when nobody's willing to sit down and actually correctly translate this information and explain it to you in a way that you can understand. That makes perfect sense. 100%.
And and I think that that then taps into one of the main, I would say, core emphasis and I don't know, like the catalyst for it, right? It's this dimension of trust and accountability, right? Like, are you having the kids of these communities translate for their parents or their great grandparents or for the community in general when they don't know the medical terminology, when they
Right.
don't, of course, have the years of training, emotional maturity to really be able, right, to translate it in an appropriate tone and manner. um, and are we doing that work? I think it's so important.
I agree. I 100% agree. And I felt even worse that I hadn't even really thought about that until I was reading your bios and like your background and stuff like that. I really hadn't thought about, is there somebody actively going out and making sure that people who maybe don't speak English as their first language understand what's going on and know how to get the vaccine and know what the side effects are and know like all the science behind the vaccine and how important it is. And that's like, I feel like that's a prime example of like a humanistic experience is I'm out here doing my best every day to be a really good person and be as informed as possible, and yet there's still this huge gap that I just didn't have to think about. I was never in a position to have to think about. And it's very powerful to have moments like that where you still kind of get put back a little bit in your place where you're like, oh, you think you're a good person, like, well, what about this whole thing that you're not looking at, right?
I mean, I think that definitely the global pandemic did that for me, right? It was this framework around, do I want to go and get a PhD in, in some intellectual discipline, or do I want to like literally give my life in this work? Of course, I was doing that discernment a few weeks before, sorry, a few months before, right? The global pandemic basically emerged. I actually did that when I was in Puerto Rico and the earthquakes were happening.
Wow.
That's initially when I started to like, do I want to continue doing academic work, or do I want to do something that's really embodying my ethics and my practices as a humanist and free thinker? And then, I moved to the States with a dear kindred of mine. And then I literally move in that late January, and then 3 weeks later the pandemic happened, and once again I'm like, whoa, like what am I doing with my life? Right. And literally that's when I said I want to do CPE. I want to really do this work. And even in the midst of all that transition, policies shifting every day, being dressed fully in PPE, less in PPE. I mean, as how life in a hospital is, right? As a staff, and then saying, I'm becoming alive, no pun intended. Like I want to do this. I see marginalization. I see how we need to care, not just for patients, but for staff, right? For the clinicians, that we really have to be in that intersections of care, right? And saying like, this is what I want to do. And that just unfolded into then applying actually after that to a residency at the Women's and Brigham's Hospital, which is how I ended up then getting connected to the Student in the Vaccine Ambassador Program and Hebrew College and what have you.
That's really cool. That's really, really cool. And do you feel like the pandemic and anything that you've been through after the pandemic strengthened your faith, weakened your faith, didn't impact your faith at all? Because I know you converted to Judaism before the pandemic, right? That was quite a few years ago.
Oh, that was during my college years.
Yeah.
So it's
well,
been,
see, like I would
while.
believe you if you told me you were 29. I would believe you if you told me you were like 35.
I'm 30.
You're 30. Okay. Yeah. So I guess that was a little bit ago because that would have been during my college years too. So do you feel like there are ever days where it's difficult to remain a person of faith, or has it strengthened your faith? Has it impacted your faith at all? Just watching what the world is going through and through your work.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the question that you're posing is key, right? I think we always have to be self-reflexive, critical around like, what is giving me meaning, right? What's helping me become more alive. And I would say that just the pandemic, that definitely strengthened my commitment to putting my life in the line, right? To care and accompany marginalized communities specifically, and of course anyone, right? Because I think that when we talk about marginalization, I think it's important to say that we're not just talking about race and ethnicity. We're talking about social and structural systems, right, that are diminishing or erasing our own humanity through multiple dimensions, right? Economic, political, cultural, religious, spiritual, ethical, you name it, right? And so I think that that's important to say. And as a humanist, like, I am really committed to the work of human flourishing. And that
I like the
work
way you said that, human flourishing. Yeah.
Thank you. And that work can only happen, in my opinion, if I'm really interested and invested in listening to the unfolding stories of who we are, right?
And
Like intentionally cultivating and sustaining relationships, right? And saying, like, I care about myself, I care about yourself. Like, this
yeah.
is a collective work that needs to happen. And so, how do we pay attention to the stories, to the histories, the experiences? Because as you're saying, like, the experiential dimension trumps over, no pun intended, right? A lot of the evidence based, a lot of the rational, a lot of the reason based dimensions, like, they can be displaced because of a specific experience that a person experienced, right? And so I think that we need to be very careful when we're doing that work in that way.
That's very interesting. I didn't even think about it that way, but you're right. I can absolutely see how, like, when somebody puts like a spiritual reason behind why they're making maybe not the best decision, you have to kind of figure out how to honor the spirituality and the beliefs, in especially in a position like yours, while also trying to figure out how you're going to navigate these other beliefs and ideas and actions they put in the name of that belief. And it's a
Right.
complicated, and I think we see that a lot here in the United States, is a lot of stuff being put forward that isn't necessarily good for the majority, right? But it's being said that it's in the name of certain deities or in the name of certain churches, and it's a difficult and complicated, um, what's the word I'm looking for? Like almost like study to be a part
Yeah,
of, to
yeah.
take, yeah. And
Right.
so,
And how are we then opening up our dialogues, right?
right,
Especially in an intergenerational framework, right? So
right,
it's not just the adults talking or the experts or
yeah,
professionals. Like, no, like all of us that are implicated as a
yeah,
society, how are we making sure that we're having open dialogue, that we're recognizing our vulnerabilities, that we're understanding that our knowledge, expertise, and experiences are limited,
yeah,
right? And how are we keeping this framework of really making sure that we're always having before us, right, the dimensions of how do we redistribute power, and
yeah,
how do we make sure that we're illuminating, right, invisibilized and marginalized philosophical, cultural, and even ethical and religious perspectives, right, that
yeah,
are always at play, yet sometimes we either forget or choose to forget.
yes,
Which
yes,
I think, kind of expanding on your last comment, right, then brings us to how are we learning and understanding historical legacies of trauma, right, and how are we hopefully doing that work of repair,
mm-hmm.
across relating and understanding alternative epistemologies and spiritualities.
Do you find that is it common or uncommon for you to run across certain like spiritual beliefs or like religious ideas that are just very difficult for you to like remain civilized when communicating with people, or is that something of your past? Do you run into that often?
I mean, I would say that given my specific context in higher ed, but also other communities and organizations that I support, that really hasn't happened often.
Good, good.
It might happen at some point,
Yeah,
right? But I think I haven't experienced it, and I think even if I have, maybe because of my vast, right, cultural and spiritual processes, like, I'm really able to become proximate to that framework, and so I'm able to really to do that interpretation, or translation rather, right, and approach it in a different way.
I like how you call it a translation. I like that a lot. And I think I've gotten a very similar response as you have. I feel like when I started this podcast at first, I said, I was going to talk to everybody. I was going to talk to people I agree with. I was going to talk to people I disagree with. I was going to talk to people from one end of the spectrum. I was going to talk to people
Right.
from the other end. And I remember thinking that it might like devolve a couple of episodes maybe into like argumentation and debate and like hostility, or that people might agree to come on here so they could get on here and just kind of like let me have it. But I've never had an unfriendly conversation. This is the 71st or 72nd episode. And I have talked to people who literally laughed at me when they heard my beliefs, like, and what I think and my opinions. And like, same, like we would establish a rapport where they could say something and I would be like, what, really? Are you serious? But I've never had a negative, angry, argumentative conversation. And I think that comes from when people feel like they don't have the chance to speak, and when people feel like they are not
Mm.
welcome to speak in a room, then they get hostile, they get angry, they feel attacked. They do that thing we always do where we like pre-plan arguments before we like talk to somebody, and we get ourselves worked up. But when you give people the chance to speak, and when you give them the chance to ask you questions, and they in turn give you the chance to ask them questions, I feel like that is honestly the fastest way to make change and to make progress. Because if somebody tells you their idea and you're like, well, that's stupid or that's ignorant, they're never going to talk to you again. But if somebody tells you their idea and you're like, so what, how is it that you came to that conclusion? And they
Right.
say this, and you say, okay, so what if I were to say that? And they respond, and you're like, okay, so then this means this. And you let them kind of recognize the gaps in the logic,
Mm.
and they start to be like, oh, that's actually I've gotten that a lot, where they're like, that's a really good question, I don't even know how to answer that question, when it's just a normal question. But because the conversation with other people has been so hostile, they've never gotten that far. And so I feel like if we want to make positive change, as hard as it is to have conversations with some people because their beliefs are so radical and their opinions are so radical, and their opinions are so like ironclad to their personality, I honestly think sitting down with them and talking to them is like the fastest way to, even if it's just planting the seed of an idea, like asking one good question. Like my friend planted that seed with me years ago, where she was like, actually, this is like, she very nicely said, this is how you're so ignorant. Like, this is how you like made that dumb comment, but I'm going to be really nice about it. And I'm going to grant you like, patience and kindness. And if you have any questions, you can come talk to me about it. And I think just planting that seed is so much more powerful than like yelling at them, or fighting fire with fire, or social
Mhm.
media battling, or anything that we've gotten accustomed to in the last few years.
I mean, you made my heart beat just a little bit faster. I mean, definitely, I think that this understanding that relationships are key,
Yes.
right? I think that, in my opinion, we're in a time where, like, information, good information, not so good information, right, is at the tip of our fingers. Like,
Yes.
we can just pull up whatever and we have that information. I think that it's at the intersections of relationship, as you're saying, we're showing up constantly, we're accompanying people, institutions, organizations, right, through their processes of growth and development, and saying, we're providing this space. You can bring your stories, you can bring your experiences, you can bring, moments of violence and trauma, and we can engage civically through this conversation,
Yes.
right? Because again, we cannot divorce the fact that we live in a society. We live in a place where the civic dimension, right, the political dimension is constantly influencing and impacting the ways in which we create meaning, right?
Yes.
The way in which we gather, we congregate, the way we vote, right?
Yes.
The way where, what religion or spirituality or ethic am I embodying or claiming publicly, right? Context and your social location is pivotal to that, right? And so I think, when can we look at ourselves critically and say, am I a humanist, an atheist, a free thinker because I was born X, Y, and Z time, place, family, location? What if I was born in another place? Right? Would I have the same framework, the same ethics, the same commitments, the same access, and economic influence, political or civic, or citizenship even, right? So I think we always have to be in this state of positive flux, where
Yes.
we're really thinking about otherwise modes of being.
Have you ever had an opinion or a belief or like a thought process that you thought for sure would never change that has since changed, that you can remember?
I mean, I think that being a humanist and a free thinker, I
Yeah.
mean, I would have never thought, right, that this was going to be my profession, that this was going to be the work that I'm doing every day and that I've been doing for the past, 2+ years. I was very much thinking that I was just gonna be, in the church,
Yeah.
right? And that was it. And I was enamored by that life, and life unfolded in such a powerful way that I explore this alternative way of being, and here I am. So I would say definitely, and especially being a humanist chaplain, as you said at the beginning, right? It gets more and more specific.
Yeah. What would you say is the most difficult part about being a humanist chaplain, and what is the most like that your favorite or the most rewarding part about being one?
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to sound trite, but I think the most challenging is that I work part-time. And so,
That's funny.
especially living in Massachusetts, I mean, it's very, very expensive,
I
right?
tried to
Talking
move
about
there before I
food.
moved
And
to Nashville. I know exactly how much you're talking.
so it's like extremely expensive, right? And so I think it's always holding this complexity of like, this is what I want to do with my life, this is what gives meaning. And
Yeah.
then the reality of like, how many times am I eating?
Yeah.
Am I resting? How much do I have to hustle to make, not even $50,000
Yeah.
a year? Which again, I do recognize that in itself is still a privilege,
Right.
right? But yet in this specific context, it's like not close to enough,
Mm.
right? On the other end, I think that a positive thing that has emerged is that I've been able just to do so much. I've been able to publish
It
some
sounds like
works.
it. I've
I've
got the
been
whole
able to
list.
mentor. Yep, yeah.
Yep.
It's a long list, and again, right? It's this balancing act of like, I'm really trying to process my own epistemologies, my ethics, my commitments in very public ways. I'm committed to sustaining and caring for individuals, communities, institutions. So I'm serving in a plethora of organizations,
Yes.
right? With no real intention of like hoarding power or saying, oh, I'm here, right? But it's this understanding, especially as a chaplain, of like presence matters, right? And so like I think that that's a more of a positive twist of
Yeah.
really being able to say like, I am here, and I'm really invested in supporting you, being a mentor, being a facilitator, being a connector, like humanism or free thought or whatever other, right, religious, spiritual, ethical life stance is possible if you think that I'm a great, not great, but a good facilitator or a good connector in that meaning making process. Like I want to serve as that bridge.
Yeah. And what is the kind of situation or scenario that somebody would approach their chaplain about, their humanist chaplain?
I mean, I would say that I've had conversations about not everything because I'm still very early in my career, but I would say we have explored conversations around like, I feel more than human, right? Like that kind of conversation to
Like
I
philosophical kind of.
right, philosophical, right? Like am I unfolding stories, histories, narratives, um to I was raised in this particular part of the world, now I'm here. And here I don't mean just Tufts, I mean right here in any of the organizations and communities that I'm involved with. And I'm here and I'm struggling, right? Like can I be a Christian if I am exploring X, Y, and Z? Am I a good, theist if I
Mm.
don't believe that that the Bible's are
Yeah.
inerrant? Sorry, right? Like just the complexity of circumstances. Um, and I say these examples because as chaplains, at least in the context of higher ed, even though our title, right, might have a specific positionality, we serve and accompany students, staff, and faculty across the unfolding of the human experience.
Yeah.
And so I'm not just bound to just the humanist community or the agnostic,
Yeah.
right? Free thinking communities. Like anyone can approach any of the chaplains, and as a confidential resource, they're really able to take that weight off and say, like, this is what's really happening in my life. Tell me,
Yeah.
and I think, of course, it varies if you're in a hospital versus if you're in higher ed, right? I think that there's a little bit more freedom and spaciousness to say, like, we can have a conversation around educational resources. We can have a conversation around within the spectrum of religion. These are, specific traditions. This is the histories. These are books that you can take and look upon. And of course, the university is providing you a plethora of resources, right,
Yeah.
through the libraries, the departments, and other staff and faculty. And so I think that it's such a very powerful and transformative um, ecosystem to
Yeah.
be involved in.
Yeah. And I think by removing the label of like a specific religion and just saying like humanist chaplain, I think that probably does so much more good when it comes to connecting people from different backgrounds and different religions, because I know that I don't think I've ever been as open and accepting and interested in other religions except since I've been an open atheist. I feel like
Hmm.
I was having a conversation because I come from the American South. I was raised Baptist. And I remember when it was worse to be a different religion than not religious at all. Like it was worse to be a Pentecostal or a Catholic
Right?
than it was to be
Yes.
an atheist. Because at least if you're an atheist, they can be like, well, you just don't know anything. You just need to learn the Lord. But if you're the wrong kind of Christian, it's like, oh no, you've been indoctrinated. You've been you've been like brainwashed. And so I think by like welcoming everyone from all backgrounds to talk to you, and by kind of embracing this image of kind of a catch-all helper, a catch-all, somebody you can talk to. And I like that you specified that it's private, and it's nobody else has to hear about it. It's just between you and them. I wonder if that might actually help people learn how to talk to other people in a better way, because they see how you communicate, and it doesn't matter, as human beings, it doesn't matter if we're Catholic, if we're Baptist, if we're Buddhist, if we're Jewish, if we're anything. We have pain, we have happiness, we have things that we really like, music and food, and we have things that we don't like, like the way that we're treated by certain people or things that are happening. And I think that there's this opportunity to kind of recognize, even if somebody wants to remain, a staunch Catholic the rest of their lives, or even if they want to remain, a Baptist minister the rest of their lives, there's this idea that outside of the Bible and outside of religious text, we're all so similar. And we all have so many things that we can relate to, and we all struggle, and we've all felt love. Some people, they loved the same gender. Some people loved multiple genders. Some people loved the opposite gender, but we've all felt like love and heartache and those same exact human feelings. And so I think it's great that I didn't even know there was such a thing as a humanist, a humanist chaplain, until I read your bio, and I was like, that's such a fantastic idea. That's such a good idea. And I think it's great that they got you in there, and that's your job, because I think just talking to you in this 1 hour, I feel like I'm already feeling the effects of like having gone to you as my chaplain and just like talk to you about stuff, because it's a very like
Thank
disarming
you.
experience.
And I mean, you're tapping into another dimension, right, which is spiritual direction, where I also got a training in, and I think that, of course, that's another whole conversation. However, I think that the synergy between those two, of spiritual direction and chaplaincy, is the curation of intentional spaces,
Yes.
right, where we really grapple with the difficult questions, right, not necessarily the answers, the conclusions, right, but being able to be in this space where this professionally trained, right, chaplain and spiritual director and what have you, is fully invested in listening beyond the words, right? Like really paying attention to what is behind the words, behind the pain. How can I accompany you? How can I sit with you through
Yes.
these moments? And really, again, not providing an answer necessarily, but saying we can be here and we can begin to deconstruct the social issues that are consuming you.
Mm-hmm.
That we can sit here and say, I want to grapple with listening, with sharing, with curating, with risking and reckoning of these meaning making processes that, as you're saying, potentially I've never had the opportunity of coming to another person and saying, this is the pain, this is the suffering, these are the scars and the wounds that I have. And I want to take the agency right now, because of this context, come to you how many times I need to, and began that process of healing.
I love that. I love that. And also, you have like the best vocabulary of any person I've ever met. Some of the words you're choosing to use, I'm like, that's such a good way to put that. That's such a good way to describe that. Well, Anthony, this has been an absolutely wonderful conversation. If you had advice, or if you had tips for anybody who, regardless of their religion or their gender or their sexuality, maybe they're struggling, they're feeling a little bit lost, they're not sure if the way that they want to live is in line with their personal religion or anything like that, what would you say to somebody who's confused and lost?
I mean, I wouldn't use the word lost. I would say that exploring life itself is very complex and messy. And sometimes we don't have the vocabulary or the experience, right, to put those labels and those terms. But I would say, dare to live, right? Like, again, life, like you said, life is painful. There's suffering, there's violence, even in the humanist non-theist communities, right? The labels don't matter. This is a human, right, action, and sometimes, hurtful actions that are taken. Yet, these are processes to humanizing each other. And so I would say, if you're going through processes or encounters or unfoldings where your specific context, community is not really filling you up, right, giving you life, go online like you did, right? Like, go online, look it up, reach out. As you're saying, as we've been talking for this past hour, emails, text, like, continue to look, continue to knock. And again, I'm here, right? And if I cannot accompany you, if I don't have the answer that you need, let's look together. Because one thing is for sure, we're not alone. And we really have to demystify that. We have to decenter that narrative, right? There is more than enough to explore, to embody, to live. And I would just say, like, dare to immerse yourself in this journey.
That's wonderful. That is so awesome. Anthony, thank you so much for your wisdom, your stories, your thoughts and opinions. I think a lot of people will listen to this and they'll find a comfort in the explanations that you give, and I think they'll find a comfort in the idea that there is more out there. There's more resources out there. There's more ideas out there. There's more people out there. What we hear and what we see on a daily basis isn't what it is. That's not everything that's out there. And you moved halfway across the world and found that out and found a new path, but sometimes you don't even have to do that. I think, like you said, you just need to log on to the right website, or Google the right question, or join the right club on campus, or find your secular or religious groups to be a part of, people to talk to. Absolutely wonderful, Anthony. I've restored faith in humanity that people like you are out here. So thank you for doing that.
Thank you so much.